Israel. But in any event, I often get asked about this book, which is, as was mentioned, it's about rescue, and it's about people who rescued Jews specifically during the Holocaust, and specifically non-Jews who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and which is, as I'll get into, a very undercovered area of Holocaust studies. But I often get asked, what was the origin of the book? And for me, the origin of my interest actually goes back quite a while to, I'm sure you all recognize the what I have up on the screen right now, which is the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And when it opened up on the mall, I was a student at Yale, so I was like 19 or 20, and my family actually was not directly affected by the Holocaust. Most of us have been in the United States, most sides of my family, since the 19th century. But like a lot of American Jews, we went down to see the exhibit, and I remember going through it, and it's intentionally, and it's quite different, obviously, from Yad Vashem in this way. It's very, very, very difficult. It's very, very, very bleak. As I've talked about the book, a lot to both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences, everyone seems to remember the same thing that I remember and had a big impact on me, which is on the right, which is this pile of shoes of people who perished in the Holocaust. And if you look carefully, obviously there's a lot of children's sizes, and so we have to remember that of the 6 million, 1.5 million were children. And I found this extremely traumatic, and I came out, I remember, into a small exhibit that they had at the time of people who had tried to help, and I particularly gravitated to some photos of this group of people who were known as the White Rose, and particularly the guy on the left, whose name was Alexander Shmorel. I mean, these were kids who were about my age at the time. They were mostly medical students. The girl in the middle was actually a college student. Her brother, who's on the left of that picture, was named Hans Scholl. Her name is Sophie Scholl. They were part of something called the White Rose. And what they tried to do was basically foment a student uprising in Germany against the Nazis and against Hitler. And they did it largely by circulating leaflets over the course of a year throughout, starting in the University of Munich, where they were students, into other universities. They got as far as Vienna. They also sent them to people in the mail. And they were these wonderful idealistic people. And in fact, they are amongst the first people to publicize the Holocaust and what was going on with the Jews. In fact, the second leaflet, which was written by Shmorel, the guy with the pipe, said that there'd been 300,000 Jews already killed in the most bestial way. And so they were really, quite heroic. This was a capital crime. And what happened was, one day they were at the University of Munich, and they had one of the leaflets, and the brother and the sister, Hans and Sophie, were leaving the leaflets outside of classes, so when the bell rang, people would pick them up. And at the end, she had a number of extra leaflets in her handbag, and at the top of an atrium at the school, that she kind of like threw them down, and they were floating down like sort of like snowflakes. And the maintenance man, who was an ardent Nazi, locked the door, called the Gestapo, who arrived within minutes and arrested these siblings and one other member of the White Rose. They were hauled into court. Hitler sent his favorite judge down. They were executed within days. The other 3 members of the group were apprehended and executed. It was actually a well-known case. It was spoken about on the radio in the US by Thomas Mann. Later, the British actually would drop the leaflets over Germany. So this wasn't, again, we can get into what we knew and who knew what and when, but we knew a lot more about the Holocaust, including in the United States, than people realize. And the thing that struck me about this was that when Sophie Scholl testified at her trial, she said, everyone in Germany, most people in Germany think like we do. They're just afraid to say it. But of course, this was completely not true. and they were like extremely unusual people, as I'll get into, very rare, and they paid for their lives for trying to get what they thought were other like-minded, idealistic students to rise up against the regime with basically almost no success. And this story stayed with me. I almost wrote my thesis on it, but I don't know German. And on the 75th anniversary of their execution, I wrote an article about it on the opinion page of the New York Times. And article went completely viral. It was shared all over the internet. It went to one of the top stories of the day at the New York Times. And I noticed also, all the comments, and this is on the internet. I mean, I've written about like monetary policy and gotten anti-Semitism, but there was not one Nazi comment, not one, anti-Semitic comment about something that had to do directly with the Holocaust. And I started writing these stories up because I realized that there's some sort of, they're very undertold, first of all, but also there's a hopefulness, I think, that that people want to believe in. And I think that's important. And I started writing them up for the Times and the Journal and the LA Times. And I had one article in the LA Times that went to #2 on Reddit about how the King of Morocco saved all the Jews. The only thing that beat me was a girl taking a cardboard cutout of Danny DeVito to the prom. And I mention that sort of because it's funny, but also that is the audience. So this was seen by, probably, tens of millions of people. And again, not one comment ever, and this has been true since I wrote the book, negative online. And believe me, I look online on Twitter and on the comments. And so there's something about these stories that strikes a chord and seems to bring out a good side of people. So I decided to turn them into this book. And the book is basically tells 10 stories of rescue. And it also talks about why people did this, and what we can do to foster more of this kind of behavior in our society. I'd say that rescue is a very understudied part of the Holocaust, and it's a little bit there's some historical reasons for that. It's kind of odd because the stories themselves, to the extent that they're known, and it's basically people know the story of Raoul Wallenberg and Oskar Schindler, and some people know the story of Denmark. And once you get past people who really are interested in the Holocaust, or who are historians of the period, almost none of these stories are known, even though these are some of the most heroic people and actions who ever lived. And World War II is a period of time that is of continual interest to many, many, many people. And there are a number of reasons actually why initially it was understudied. In the immediate post-war period, as the kind of trauma of the Holocaust became public, people, and this is, I think, part of human nature, were much more interested in evil. They were interested in, why did people do this? Why did people go along with it and collaborate? Why did people stand by while this was happening? You see a picture here of the Milgram experiments at Yale. There was the Stanford prison experiments. So there was a lot of focus on why people behaved the way they did, which makes sense because that was the vast majority of people. You also have the fact that the rescuers themselves, which I'll get into, were, for the reasons why, but they were largely silent about what they had done. Part of that is modesty, and part of it is for some other reasons, but the main reason was they actually didn't think they had done anything particularly remarkable. And then the one thing that I do think makes I'm somewhat sympathetic to is the initial survivors, many of whom had been through camps in particular. Many of them had not been rescued, and so there was this concern that we not distort the record because rescue was so rare. Even though at Yad Vashem, from its founding, one of its core missions in Israel is actually to recognize the righteous. And in fact, my book's title, "In the Garden of the Righteous," is the garden there, where every time they award someone the title of righteous among the nations, which has very strict criterion, they plant a tree, and it's now a forest. So, Golda Meir, when she dedicated it, had a line where she said that that the rescuers were drops of love in an ocean of poison, and that the Jewish people will forever and always remember what they did for us. But again, just to put in perspective, so the amount of people recognized at Yad Vashem at the moment is a little over 27,000 people. I think we can get into in the book why that's an understated number, and there were more people, and it depends how you define rescue and who rescued and the evidence that's surviving. But even if you multiply by 100, it's still a vanishingly small number of people. But if you take the 27,000 people, it's out of a population of 500 million. So one example I like to give to sort of visualize this is if you filled up, since we have some other New Yorkers here, I'll just go ahead and use Madison Square Garden as an example. If you filled up Madison Square Garden with a representative sample of European citizens at the time, or pretty much any basketball stadium, you would have one person who's a righteous among the nations. So they were really rare. And so for a long time, there wasn't a focus on them. In the late 60s, there was an interest, particularly spearheaded by a lot of children who'd been rescued and hidden. My friend Abe Foxman was one of kind of the pioneers of this, to put more of a focus on rescue, and honoring the people who had risked their lives, in many cases gave their lives or suffered greatly for what they did to save Jews and other people who the Nazis were hunting. And for me, I think there's a few reasons why these stories are really, really important. One is, I think Jews in particular, but I think that all people of goodwill owe these people a debt of gratitude for their example. And also, we need to correct the historical injustice that everyone knows the name of Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Goering, but nobody knows, or few people know, for example, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who saved maybe 30,000 people, or Irena Sendler, who saved 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. So that's one reason I think it's really important to understand and know and tell these stories. I also think it's really important because we can learn a great deal from what motivated these people, why they did this, why other people didn't do it. I'm particularly interested, which I'll get into community rescue, where you had places that, say, like Nedmark, that saved all their Jews. Why did that happen? That's very relevant today. How do you create countries or locations or even organizations that, prevent bigotry and hatred from taking root? And then I think another important part of the rescue stories is that, look, rightfully, that rescue should be a small part of Holocaust studies, because there should, the enormity of what happened is boggles the mind. But even relative to that, it's understudied. But I think I can't emphasize enough that it is also an entryway to start talking about the Holocaust, particularly with children, right? I mean, like, I remember reading Night in 8th grade. It's pretty traumatic. There's some very good, like, kind of, mid-grade books like Number the Stars that start talking about the Holocaust through rescue, because it gives hopeful reasons. And then you start asking, okay, well, why was someone being rescued? It's because something terrible was going on, or what was going on. And I remember after 9/11, they brought Mr. Rogers out of retirement, and they asked him, how do you talk to children about this? And he said, well, you need to look to the helpers and start by talking to them about the people that are trying to help. And this is also true for adults. I mean, I've had people ask me on the radio in Arizona, can you tell our audience what the Holocaust is? Okay. And people, when they start to, it's really hard to get your head around, and many people turn off. I mean, even with what happened on October 7th, there's a lot of people I know who feel imperative to watch the footage that's circulating, and other people who just can't. I'm talking about Jewish people who can't bring themselves to look at it. And so, as a friend of mine who made a documentary about one of the stories in the book, it's kind of like, he uses an analogy. It's like a banister you can hold on to when you confront the Holocaust. So I think the stories of rescue, both as models, but also as sort of entry points into understanding the Holocaust, are really, really important. And they're really important, also in combating like denial, because it's a way of kind of getting people to understand what happened. Um, so question of like, why were there, I often get asked, are there commonalities? Are there things that all of these rescuers had in common? And the answer is yes and no. So, as I mentioned, there was very little systematic psychological work done on rescue. There was one Freudian study that was done in the 60s by Holocaust survivors, a husband and wife, and they really the only thing they could find in common was that how you were disciplined as a child seemed to have a correlation, but that's not very satisfying. But what I have observed from having looked at probably thousands of these stories is a few things. First of all, I can say one thing, which is educational attainment has absolutely nothing to do with whether someone was a rescuer or not. As they said of the people in the Chambon who saved 5,000 people, they didn't read the newspaper, but they read the Bible. And in fact, in some cases, it was negatively correlated because at the Wannsee conference, where the Nazis implemented the final solution, everyone had either a PhD or a law degree. So that was not correlated, but generally, people who were in international professions were tended to be more rescuers. People who did things that were creative. I have a circus. There's a rescue in a circus in the book. People generally who had a belief in something greater. This was very critical, and often it was religion. It could be political. It could have been a belief in nonviolence, but in general, it was religion. That was across religions. It was Protestants, Catholics, it was Orthodox, it was Muslims, but it was people who were interested in religion, not because of external displays of like piety and how righteous they were, but people who really took to heart lessons of like, like over the temple at the Chambon, the Protestant temple, it said, love thy neighbor. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews than anything else in Europe at the time. The other thing is, and this is where I think is actually almost universal in every story I looked at, was that everybody who rescued, for the most part, had some role model, often, almost always, usually a parent, sometimes both parents, but it could also have just been an adult in early childhood who did a couple of things. One is that they generally that they would expose them to other people, say that we're all kind of like one group of, brotherhood of man, that we shouldn't be bigoted. They also, like Irena Sendler's father, who was a doctor, told her, if you see someone drowning, you have to help them. So there was this belief that, you shouldn't be prejudiced against others and you should help others, and we're all, God's children. The other thing they did, which is a little bit less obvious, but is very correlated, is that most of these people grew up in very loving households. Their interests were valued, they were valued, and that is important because it tends to correlate with self-esteem. And if you think about it, to be a rescuer, you have to have a very, very strong sense of self. Some of these people would have been considered eccentric in normal times because you have to, first of all, believe your moral compass is correct when everyone else is doing something very different. And you have to also have the ability to believe that you not only should you act, but if you act, you will be successful in acting. So that kind of self-esteem often is correlated with how you were treated and valued as a child. So I say this because, again, a lot of how society is created, what we do, the most important thing is children, and the most important thing is like early childhood education and about a lot of things, including just how you navigate the world. A couple things I would say about rescuers is that they also were almost universally modest about what they did. Very few of them were like I don't know if anybody watches Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. The father-in-law tells everybody that he rescued 6 Jews. Like, that is very not that. The language that these people use is actually almost eerily the same. They all say, I did what any normal person would do. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did the right I did the right thing. Anybody else would have done this, which of course is not true, but they it is like almost universally the same language that they use. Many of them were very reticent to talk about what they did. So part of it was that modesty, but there were some other reasons as well that I think led them, first of all, to be reticent, but also that many rescuers were punished for what they did and hated after the war. Oskar Schindler had rocks thrown at him in the streets of Germany. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, just because the Allies won the war didn't mean that anti-Semitism went away. So after the fact, a lot of people would say to rescuers, why did you do this? Who likes the people hate the Jews? Like you could have risked all of our lives. You shouldn't have done this. And there was a lot of resentment. Behind the Iron Curtain, which again, people forget, like a big portion of the killing fields of the war were in the East. After the Iron Curtain came down, there was institutional anti-Semitism there as well. And actually, if you were found to be a rescuer, you were automatically suspect because, first of all, there were people, helping the Jews was very bad, and also there was a suspicion that you had been part of the underground with the Allies, so you were therefore anti-communist. So you had many people before the fall of the Berlin Wall who had even people with the righteous medals had them in their drawers, and no one wanted to talk about it. And Irena Sendler, who I mentioned earlier, again, she her children, she wasn't allowed to get her medal from Israel. Her children were not allowed to go to university. So that's another factor. And then, I often think about why people were hated so much. And I think another thing that's sort of unspoken, but kind of jumps out at you, is that rescuers are very inconvenient because it's very difficult to have the narrative that a lot of people had after the war. Well, I couldn't have done anything. I was against it, but I just, what could we do? When you have people who are living there who are actually living proof that you could have done something. So I think that's another reason why there was so much resentment for them. I will spare you. I will briefly talk about a couple of stories in the book, and then because hopefully you'll all want to read it. And I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the why people did this, but I opened the book and the Christian Science Monitor, because again, the book is meant for a general audience and obviously as a Jewish audience, but it's actually been pretty well received in non-Jewish audience as well, which I'm very happy about. So the Christian Science Monitor called this gentleman, Aristides Sousa Mendes, the breakout star of the book. And I'll just give you, I don't know how many people have heard of him. I wrote an article about him as well for the New York Times that went completely viral as well. But he was a aristocratic Portuguese diplomat, and he was they think that he did the largest single rescue by an individual during the Holocaust. So he may have saved as many as 30,000 people. He certainly saved at least 10,000 people, and he did it over the course of 3 weeks. And he ended up, he and his brother he was an identical twin. His brother actually became the foreign minister under Salazar, and they both were in the foreign service. Sousa Mendes was sort of a different kind of diplomat. He was one of these amazing hosts. So he was posted all over the world. He had this huge family of 14 children. He had two sons that were born when he was posted in Berkeley, California. And he had unbelievable people coming in and out of his house, including Albert Einstein, teaching his children, math, and his daughter was the flower girl in a royal wedding. And so he was like that kind of diplomat. And he happened to find himself in June of 1940 in Bordeaux, and he was the consul general there, which meant that he was in charge of visas. And this was right when the Germans invaded France. Paris fell, which created the largest traffic jam in the probably history of the world, and it was a site of horrendous trauma and war crimes, with the Luftwaffe was overhead strafing people with bullets, and people saw their family members die. And I opened the book actually with the rescue of the people who wrote Curious George, who rode a bicycle from Paris down to Bordeaux and Bayonne. What happened with Sousa Mendes was there had been so the dictator of Portugal Salazar, basically had one. He was a very complicated Machiavellian figure. He wasn't. He was anti-communist. He wasn't completely a fascist. But he was a close ally of Franco, who was an ally of obviously of Hitler and Mussolini. And Salazar's main goal in the war was to keep Portugal out of it. And in order to keep Portugal out of it, he needed to keep Spain out of it. And this part of that was Franco wanted no refugees. And so Salazar had issued an order called Circular 14 to all of the, as a refugee crisis was brewing, to all of the consulates around the world, saying no visas for, there were a number of people prescribed, but it was basically, no Jews, no people without passports. And there was a list of people actually who could come in, which was basically Americans, British, French, and Belgians if they were famous for some reason. Everyone obeyed this, okay? And when you had this refugee crisis in Bordeaux, you had literally 1 million people descended on Bordeaux in June of 1940. The government of France fled there, as they had in the Franco-Prussian War and in World War I. The Vichy government that would be in power shortly was there. De Gaulle was there. It was like, and literally millions of refugees sleeping on the streets, and people were going door to door to try to get exit visas, and everyone slammed the door shut except for, including the United States. But the rumor went around that maybe the Portuguese consulate, who had given a couple of visas previously to people on the run, might be sympathetic. So Sousa Mendes was there. He was a devout Catholic, and he was just a humanitarian by spirit. And he came out one day, and there was a huge amount of Jews in front of the Portuguese embassy consulate. And he saw a young rabbi who also had a very large family, and they were sleeping on the street. And he said to them, he had sent his family back to Portugal, except for his 2 oldest sons, and his nephew happened to be there, and who were like in their 20s. And he said, I have this very large consulate, and there's plenty of room. Don't sleep on the street. Come here and spend the night. And so the rabbi did with his family. And then after they spoke overnight, and Sousa Mendes told him, he thought he was descended from conversos, which he probably was based on his name and where he lived. He said, look, I'd like to help you out. I think I can give you visas for you and your family. And the rabbi said to him, I couldn't accept those, because what about all of my other fellow Jews? And then, so he refused the visas and he left. And Sousa Mendes was like thunderstruck, and he took to his bed, and he had what he described to his brother, and I've seen his notes in Portuguese, as a nervous breakdown. And he just was tortured by this. And then he got up out of his bed very dramatically, and he said to his family, he said, I'd rather stand with God against man than with man against God. And then he went out onto the street, and he made this very dramatic announcement. He said, I'm going to give a visa to every single person who needs it, regardless of your religion or background. And then over a 3-week period, he proceeded to do that. Among the people he saved were Salvador Dali, the Habsburgs, the Rothschilds, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's dealer, Jean-Michel Franck, mentioned the Curious George people, but he also just saved thousands and thousands of, refugees, mostly Jews. And he then, in an act of supreme pettiness, a British woman showed up at the consulate for a regular tourist visa and was asked to wait a few minutes because there was a refugee crisis. And she stormed out, complained to the British embassy. They wired Lisbon, and they went crazy. They sent down people from Lisbon, very senior diplomats, to stop Sousa Mendes. And they kind of chased him all over the South because he was in charge of other consulates. So there was this cat and mouse game that went on for the 3 weeks until Vichy capitulated and the door slammed shut, where he was issuing visas and escorting people across the border. And so that, and then it stopped. And then for his troubles, he was summoned back to Lisbon. He was put on disciplinary hearing. The disciplinary hearing found that he had defied orders, but it was he should be reprimanded because of his humanitarian instinct, but it was inappropriate. The foreign minister actually overruled that and said he should be demoted. And then it went up to Salazar himself, who said, actually, he's fired and his pension is cut in half. And Sousa Mendes, who had grown up very wealthy, ended up going through his entire life savings, burned the furniture. His children had to leave Portugal. To add insult to injury, Salazar later in the war actually took credit for what he did because he sort of switched sides, realized the Allies were going to win, and became a close ally of us. And one of the things that they did to sort of pitch the Portuguese as, you know, his regime as being worthwhile, being part of NATO, was that they saved the refugees, which they did later in the war. But they ruined Sousa Mendes' life, and his wife died prematurely. He had a stroke, and you know, none of his colleagues would talk to him. And there was a very poignant moment where the Jewish community tried to support him in Lisbon, and he would often eat at the soup kitchen. And there was a part of the soup kitchen that was, you know, nicer, that was for Portuguese, and then there was part for refugees. And he would come in this in his threadbare diplomatic garb, very elegant. And he was in the refugee area, and this young Jewish teenager who was working there came over to him and said, "Sir, you're Portuguese. You should go into the other room." And this is for refugees. And he said, "We are all refugees." So, just an amazing person. I mean, people ask me like, "Who's your favorite story?" And it's like, "Who's your favorite child?" But he's definitely one of my favorites. But again, as an example of somebody who was completely overlooked by history. And he's now a national hero in Portugal, but it took a very, very long time. It wasn't until the 90s. And both Israel and the United States recognized him before his own country did. So that's just an example of, you know, one of the stories. I mentioned earlier, story of, you know, a rescue in the circus. There was a famous Jewish circus family. There were a lot of Jews in the circus. I learned a lot about the history of the circus. Again, very multicultural, multinational milieu. The Nazis went after them the same way they went after all other Jews and all other kind of, you know, creative people. And this is the story of this man on the left, Adolf Althoff, and his wife Maria, who were very, you know, they're from these multi-generation, very famous circus family. And he hit a family of Jews, starting with this girl in the middle there of the picture on the right, who was a acrobat in the circus while it traveled around Germany, and was viewed by the Gestapo at almost every stop. And this went on for years, and he successfully managed to basically hide them in plain sight. So it's a pretty amazing story. The German circus owner. This is sort of the story of Greece. Greece had the worst outcome in the history in all of any place in the Holocaust. 95% of Greek Jews perished, but they were largely in Thessaloniki. The story in Greece and Athens, where there's a third kind of Jew that I was not familiar with until I did this research, which is a Romanov, who have been there since Alexander the Great. They were rescued to a much greater degree by the church and by civil society. So the man in the middle is Archbishop Damaskinos. He's the only head of a formal church to denounce the Holocaust, as did almost all of the civil society in Athens. On the right is the chief of police. They work together, giving fake baptismal certificates and fake identity cards to many Jews. And so you had a very, very high survival rate in Athens and in the islands. It's also because the Italians had initially occupied there, which is a whole other topic to talk about, that the Italians generally they did not do roundups, and so as long as you were in the Italian zone, you were safe. But it was after the Italian capitulation that the Nazis themselves came in. On the left is Princess Alice. You may be familiar with her from The Crown. She is actually King Charles's grandmother. So she is the mother of Prince Philip, and she was a really amazing person. She's buried in Israel. Her story is really worth knowing. She was related to pretty much every major royal figure in Europe. Her great grandmother was Queen Victoria. Her cousin was the Kaiser. Her aunt was the Tsarina. And she hid a family of Jews in Athens during the war, and also ran an orphanage that was feeding about 1,500 orphans, and never told anybody what she did. And it only came out because the family that she rescued told her brother, Lord Mountbatten. And this is a story that is really unknown. They didn't really mention it in The Crown. Charles is quite interested, and he's quite interested in the book, and he's interested in her story. And actually, I wrote an article in CNN during the coronation. The oil he was anointed with is from the convent where she's buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So extremely heroic, extremely unknown, despite being a very famous person. And Prince Harry's book came out um, around the time mine did, and I was telling people, like, I'm not that interested in his story, but even if you are, the story of his great grandmother, Princess Alice, is much more interesting, and much more heroic. This is on the left is a guy named Gino Bartali. Gino Bartali was probably he was definitely the most famous athlete in Italy, might have been the most famous athlete in Europe at the time. He won the Tour de France in 1938, and would go on to win it again in 1948. But what he did during the war, and again, a major celebrity, never really told anybody what he did, is he did a couple of things. He hid, you can see the family on the lower right. He hid a family of Jews in his basement, as well as a Jew and a Romani man in his bicycle shop for the duration of the war. And then, maybe even more amazing, he was part of what was called the Assisi Underground. As I mentioned earlier, it was only after there was discrimination in Italy, but there weren't roundups. And it was only, ironically, after we invaded Italy in 1943 and came up and got bogged down right south of Rome, and the Germans themselves came in the north, that the Germans, with the really ardent fascists, started rounding up Jews, and then many of them went into hiding. And the church has a very mixed record, obviously, but the spearhead of this network, which was centered on Assisi, a town where they don't think any Jew had lived prior to the war, but where during the war, hundreds were hid in the monasteries and convents and cloisters. And many of the clergy, like Bartali was so famous, his personal priest was the Archbishop of Florence, Della Costa, who has been honored by Yad Vashem and actually had been a candidate to be Pope at the previous conclave. If he had been Pope, the church would have had a very different record, because he was one of the spearheads of this underground. And he recruited Bartali. And what was fascinating about Bartali was he was not only, probably the only person in Italy who had the ability to ride his bike hundreds of miles a day. He had an excuse to do it. And so he was this celebrity. And what he did is, inside of his bicycle, he had forged papers, identity papers for Jews. And he would go from Genova to Assisi to Rome to Florence and bring these papers. And he would also do things like, he would show up at a train station, and because he was so famous, everyone would come running over and giving him a cappuccino. And in the back, the partisans would move Jewish refugees from one train to another, heading south, and because the guards would be completely distracted. And so they, through his work with the underground, he saved hundreds of Jews. And again, never told anybody. He was asked about it. It was sort of an open secret, and he would always change the subject. And he said, I don't want to, good is something you do. And if you talk about it, it takes away from it. And he confided in his son, who later told the story, as did the little boy you see on the right, years later. But Bartali had this wonderful quote where he said, he said, I want to be remembered as a cyclist. And he said, some medals are pinned to your jacket for winning a bicycle race. Others are pinned to your soul, and you get them in the next life. So kind of an amazing story. Some people may be familiar with this story, which is of Sugihara, the Japanese diplomat. The picture on the left was actually taken by his sister-in-law outside the window of, this is what he saw when people started lining up in Lithuania. And he gave people visas. You can see them on the right, that, again, thousands of visas. He single-handedly actually probably rescued a big chunk of the scholarship, Talmudic scholarship, which was a project of Himmler to destroy. His fear was that it would resurface in the United States, which is what happened. And many of the people rescued by Sugihara were yeshiva students. An unsung hero of this was this man on the left, Jan Schwartzendijk, who was a Dutch. Sugihara was a spy, actually. He was under diplomatic cover. And Schwartzendijk was a businessman who was appointed honorary consul like 2 days before the Soviets invaded. And they never really met, but he actually gave people visas to Curacao, which you would then take to Sugihara, who would give you a Japanese transit visa. And then people would go through Russia. It's an amazing story. And again, people with, sort of no real connection to Jews previously, kind of organically coming together in this network. I mentioned Irena Sendler. Some people know her story. She was a social worker, ended up, 29 years old, ended up running a network of Jewish, mostly young girls, Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto, non-Jews outside, saved 2,500 children, infants, toddlers, teenagers. She smuggled out to the forest to join the partisans. She dressed up like a nurse, and went literally in and out every day. She knew it so well that she was the person that was asked to give Jan Karski the famous tour of the Warsaw Ghetto, which he later reported on to FDR and was kind of ignored. She was actually at one point arrested. She was tortured. She was being led to her execution, but the Polish underground paid a bribe to get her out. And again, saved, kept a list of all of the Jews, what their real names were, in the hope that one day they might be reunited with their families. But she, again, her story sort of disappeared behind the Iron Curtain, but and she lived to be, but walked with a limp until she was, died in the age of 90. But again, did this as a, someone in her 20s, and many of people in her network were in their teens. I briefly just want to touch on community rescue. So this is Denmark, where this is Le Chambon. These are places, and I put this picture up because Le Chambon was a town. It was a Protestant town in the middle of nowhere in France. And for a variety of reasons, they rescued the whole sort of plateau, which was many towns, rescued a lot of children. The primary movers are the people on the left, who was a very famous pastor, André Trocmé, in the nonviolent movement, and his wife Magda, and their 4 children. By the way, the little girl on the right, who's now 95, I read my chapter and gave me the total recall about like the color of the carpet in her parents' bedroom, and it was amazing. But she lives in America. They saved 5,000 mostly Jewish children, and what they did is they also gave them, and I've spoken to a lot of the survivors, a real semblance of normality. The children felt protected. Many of them eventually were smuggled out, but like you can see this picture, they look like they're at summer camp or at school, and that was the feeling that they had. And by the way, this was an area of resistance. Camus was in the town next door writing the initial draft of The Plague. He very much was influenced by what went on in Le Chambon, and he talked about how nonviolence was, this. He said it was so admirable, but it required someone greater than him to do it. But I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal, and I've been talking a lot about this since October 7th. What can you learn from places in Europe that had like this nearly 100% survival rate? Denmark, Albania, majority Muslim country, a place where all 3 religions lived side by side. FDR's ambassador to Albania was a Jew. He cabled back, this is the only place in Europe where there is no religious bigotry. They had a code of honor called Besa, which they would rather turn a person over to, they'd rather die than turn someone out of their house or out of their country. And as I mentioned, it's more Jews there at the end of the war than the beginning of the war. And it wasn't for lack of focus by the Nazis, because at the Wannsee conference, when they made the list of Poland, 3 million Jews, they had Albania 200. Zakynthos was an island in Greece, 100% survival rate. There were some things that were in common among these places. They generally had again a long tradition of not tolerating religious bigotry. They stood together as one. There's an apocryphal story of the King of Denmark wearing the Star of David. It's not true, because from the first day they protested the treatment of the Jews and would not permit the Star of David to be worn. And when ultimately Hitler himself had to order the deportation, because even the SS advised against it, because they said the Danes will rise up. They evacuated almost all of them across the straits to Sweden. There were about 500 that were captured. They were sent to Theresienstadt. The government of Denmark called and checked on them every single week, sent people there to inspect them, sent them food, sent them medicine, checked on them. And in the end, only 50 people died of starvation. They were returned. And when everyone came home, which was unique in Europe, they found their plants had been watered, their animals had been fed, their businesses had been cared for. But in Denmark and all of these places, everyone stood together as one. The biggest risk to any rescue was denunciation. Happened all over Europe. These were places where that never happened. So, there was this also a strong commitment again to some communal ethos stronger than itself. And I also think one point about communities is it's important to know, like, it's very hard to judge people of how they behaved during the war because depending on where you were in Europe, the punishment was quite severe. So, it was prison in the Western Europe. In Poland, they caught you trying to save someone. They not only killed the Jewish people you were trying to save, they killed you and your family. So, very, very, you know, hard decision to risk your children's life. I wouldn't do it. So, but it's not, there's a really fascinating quote from someone in Holland who was one of these rescuers, but he said, the reason he was able to be successful is that people like him were the tip of the spear. And the difference really with the community was people, what everyone else around you thought. So if you were in a place like in Western Europe where people kind of secretly, were sympathetic to rescue, okay, then you were more likely to be successful than in places where people ran to turn you in. So, to be a rescuer or to make a difference, you don't need to be like the people in like this man or those 27,000 people. It's a community effort. And also, when you read Holocaust testimonies, people remember small gestures as well, like that kept them going. So, like letting someone stay the night, looking the other way, giving someone food. This made a big difference. I mean, Primo Levi famously wrote about a man named Lorenzo, who was a laborer who brought him soup every day. He said, this man kept me alive because someone still thought I was a human being. So I also think that's why, like, the anti-bullying campaign that people make fun of is not a joke, because when you create societies and it starts in school, and put aside like anti-Semitism, you say, okay, someone stands up for someone and more than half of the group backs them up and agrees with it and said that's not our values. You can see that even in an extreme situation, the Nazis were not able to take root in these communities. I think who we value is important, which is why I really pound the table on valuing rescuers because it's great to be support, to value movie stars, or that's great, and athletes, but also these people deserve to be, I think we have a problem in this country right now about who we value, and it's why we're getting terrible leaders, etc. So those kinds of things are important, because also when you look at how the Holocaust happened, it didn't happen in one day, right? And there were a series of events that emboldened the Nazis, and a lot of people look back at the initial Jewish boycott of Jewish businesses. And you can see from what the Nazis wrote down, because they kept records on everything, they were very emboldened by the fact, and they were surprised that so many people abided by it. And if people had shopped in those businesses and not been intimidated, they bullies back down. And there was just this constant drumbeat. The Evian conference, obviously on a grander scale, where most of the world would not take in refugees, made the Nazis think, well, instead of trying to kick these people out of our country, we can kill them and no one will care. And to some degree, they were right. I will very quickly just go over the last couple things that I mean, this is the story of Varian Fry. Many people know I have a pet project that he's been recognized, but other people have not in his group. Many of them are Americans. They single-handedly saved 2,500 of the greatest intellectuals, artists, writers, scientists in Europe. Here's a picture of Fry with most of the surrealists. Here's him with Marc Chagall. This guy has not been honored. He was an American diplomat. There's legislation. He's the only American on the list right now in Congress to recognize a number of diplomats. I mention this because this sort of, and there were Germans who objected to the Nazis about this. The brain drain, I mean, they single-handedly moved the center of the art world from Paris to New York because of, Nazi persecution. Many of the great German writers moved out to Hollywood, became screenwriters, and the scientists, many people worked on the Manhattan Project, fled. So, in some ways, people talked about Fry, this was like a gift to the United States. This is other members of his group. This is an interesting story that I conclude my book on, which I won't tell right now, but other than to say it's the story of 10 British POWs at the very end of the war coming together to save one 16-year-old Jewish girl from the death marches. And I found it very interesting because it was an example of, many of the stories are, one person saving thousands, but this was the case of 10 people at the very end of the war when they were about to be set free, risking their lives to save one person. So it was pretty powerful. So anyway, I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have. And again, happy to talk.